Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter, and I would like to welcome you to the second episode of the third season of the Sunny Views podcast. Today, in the studio with me are
Noah,
Ishan.
and today's topic may be a bit more controversial than last week, but I do believe it's equally or even more as interesting. We're going to be talking about World War II, guys, today.
Yay.
Any comments on the topic?
Well, I have a lot of connections with World War II because, my great-grandfather fought in the war, and I study history, and I go to Slovakia a lot, and there's a lot of monuments related to that. And so I find this topic really interesting, and I'm glad we're able to talk about it.
Beautiful. Ishan?
Unlike Noah, I don't have any family connections, but it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I do believe so. Without further ado, I think we should start with our first topic of the day. So, resistance movements in both Europe and abroad against both Axis and the Allies, fortunately. What do you think? Was it worth it?
Well, was it worth it? From the perspective of the people fighting, yes, obviously, because they're fighting for their own freedoms. I know a lot specifically about Slovakia because I've read up a lot about it because my relative, my great-grandfather, his name is Stefan Smolak, he fought in Slovakia against the Germans and against the occupation. And for him, it was life or death. And obviously, because he was in an occupied territory, he felt like he had to. Because he was his way of life was completely destroyed by the new war, so he wanted to end it as fast as possible and save his people.
Yeah. And do you think, ending that war quicker and, fighting the occupiers was worth the potential civilian and, building-wise economic destruction of the country? Because, for example, we can look at major uprisings. For example, in Poland, the Warsaw Uprising, very famous uprising, by the way, the whole city got wiped out. Pretty much you had 1-2 churches and everything else was just rubble. And, you could say, it was perfectly justified, understand why people would like to, fight in that resistance. And the justification for it was, hey, we've got the Soviets on the other side of the river. As soon as we start fighting, hey, they're going to come help us. Yeah. Of course, we know that didn't happen. The Soviets did wait for the uprising to finish and only then advanced through the Vistula River. So, do you think it's fully justified, even though you're fighting and you're fighting for a good cause? Of course you are. But, do you think, the morality of, the casualties that may be taken in the civilian population, I think that's, does it weigh in the balance?
Well, it's always a big risk to do anything during warfare. And while I do believe that civilian casualties are always a bad thing, and especially during this time, during wartime, civilian casualties should be avoided at all costs. But at some point, it becomes necessary, especially with what the Germans were doing in Poland, with sending them to concentration camps and all that. So I believe that it was morally correct to do it, even though civilian casualties could have been limited further. I do believe it was the correct thing to do.
Yeah. So, for example, we can look at other, resistance movements in Europe. For example, Yugoslavia, also a very famous example. We've got Tito, who I think if we would have to say, which was, I know it's a bit mean to say this, but, which resistance group was the most successful, the French, the Marquis, and Tito will be at the top. Tito pretty much with his own group took over Yugoslavia and then ruled for it for many, many years. And you think that success was just mostly luck, maybe some mix of German priorities going elsewhere, or do you think that could have been more repeated, but for some reason wasn't?
Well, I don't know much about it, honestly. I don't know much about what happened in Yugoslavia, but I do know that that area specifically was very nationalist, very for themselves, and not they don't want to be ruled by other places because throughout their history they were occupied by the Ottomans, the Greeks, the Romans, the Austrians, and now they were being ruled by the Germans. So they had developed this sort of sense of pride. So I do think it's a combination of certain factors. It could be luck, but I do think it's more just the spirit of the people that had developed in this area, more than just the luck or just skill of a leader.
Yeah, especially in Yugoslavia, considering it was further away from other conflicts, of the times German soldiers would be sent there on rotation. And I've got this beautiful story read in a book. I don't know, unfortunately remember the name of the book. But, it was about a group of insurgents in Yugoslavia in 41, I think. And they have set up a bar with a small casino in the town of Karlovac, which is south of Zagreb. in modern day Croatia. And, they would take the money that the German officers would spend in said bar and said casino and then fund their own militia of it. And unfortunately, the leader of said group, his name was, I think, Ivan Svitkovic. He met a tragic end before the war. It is a kind of a funny story, but it's still tragic because, he passed away. By the end of the war, his band of militiamen secured a German panzer. And they were making their way down even more south of Karlovac to their small base. And another group had set up an ambush there to kill a German officer who was also leaving that same route. And a anti-vehicle mine blew up the tank which Ivan was in. Yeah, it's kind of compared to modern day resistance movements. You can't really organize that well. They didn't have radios. Radios were pretty much perfected in World War II. And a lot of these resistance movements, especially in Yugoslavia, succeeded because they were very decentralized. You look at modern insurgencies, Afghanistan, Ireland, for example, the IRA. We look at Iraq. These small decentralized cells of insurgents. You can't really target them as well as you could a conventional army. So I do think that maybe that did participate in the success of Tito's takeover of Yugoslavia.
Yeah. A similar thing actually happened in Slovakia. In eastern Slovakia, where my grandfather's from, he was living in the town called Michalovce. And they had, similar thing like the insurgents. They lived in the forest. And my father once told me a story that his grandfather, who was the Stefan Smolak, who I talked about before, he told me a story of how they had, there was a bridge crossing a small river which they used, which was a major supply line for the Ukrainian front. Because, it's right there and it's a path through the Carpathians because you'd go from Michalovce, you'd go into Ukraine through Carpathian Ruthenia. So they wanted to stop this supply line from going through. So what they did is they blew up the bridge. And while on the bridge, a German officer had been killed. So the Germans responded by burning Michalovce and Vinne to the ground, which were like the surrounding towns. So in a way, what we talked about before, is it worth the civilian casualties? Because at that point, supply lines had diverted to other places. It wasn't detrimental, but it also was a significant blow because it slowed down the advance.
I think it also was a more of a symbolic victory, morale-wise. Hey, we blew up a bridge. Than a strategic one.
Yeah, but morale is always important.
Yeah. Also, I think blowing up a major supply route would slow down an army. So.
Yeah.
Now with a second topic that we could mention today is all the technological innovations we mentioned already, the radio, but all the technological innovations that came out of the war. For example, we can think of radar, which was pretty much developed by the British, and by the end of the war was in a usable state, but it still needed some innovation, and only by the 50s that we have actual airborne radars which would actually be useful for anything. We can also think at plasma, which it was developed before the war, but during World War II. We could even call it a Allied Wunderwaffe, because the ability to pretty much substitute blood, which needed refrigeration, a powder, which could be then turned into plasma, could be shipped anywhere in the world, didn't need refrigeration, didn't need any form of special storage. So, what other innovations, do you think really got developed in World War II, and we see them today?
The atomic bomb.
Yeah, that definitely.
That.
Yeah. Jet aircraft as well.
Fun fact, they did start a development before the war. The British they started in World War I. They didn't really start as jet aircraft. There was an experimental Italian design which used a form of ramjet, which was then used, I don't remember the exact German plane, but the one that looked like a T, which used coal as ramjet powder. It was never even produced, it was just a sketchboard, but jet engines were a thing before, but only then the Germans saw potential, even though it was a very maturing technology. The Me-262 was not by any means a superior aircraft. We can remember that, the P-51 Mustang, the D version, did take fight with them. The P-47 as well, which was pretty much known for shooting down Me-262s. Ishan, any comments about technological innovations during World War II? You've been staying a bit silent. We've been kind of cutting you off for a bit now.
A bit. No, I'm not really that familiar with the technology side of it. But during the war, the Allies had to, innovate. There's a lot of innovation because it was quite a deadly war. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So a lot of innovation. I think the Germans by the end developed the first automatic rifle, which led to the creation of the AK-47, which arguably is the most recognizable.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut you because as someone who's very into firearms, I can tell that is complete. Well, not to use a very mean word, but that is completely false.
Is it?
It's the only similarities are just construction-wise because there's a detachable magazine, there's a separate grip. But actually, the AK is quite an interesting story. It's more similar in its construction of the internal mechanisms to M1 Garand.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with the weapons story.
Me neither.
Yeah, and if we talked about nuclear weapons, we talk about jet engines. We forgot how to talk about rockets. Since rocket technology has pretty much took a jump start during World War II with both the V1, which you could say was technically a rocket. It was the first cruise missile, definitely. Yeah. But the V2 definitely was the first successful rocket design. There were some before, but that was the most successful design. And, after the war, you remember Operation Paperclip, Operation Zakovicum in the USSR, and Paperclip in the US.
Yeah.
And do you think, it was ethically just to import German scientists to produce this? Considering all the death and suffering they produced, not only from impact of these weapons on the UK, for example, or the V2 rocket, but also the deaths that took place in the labor camps, which were used to produce components for these rockets. Do you think the value of these scientists for the scientific community for space exploration was outweighed, the moral dilemmas with all the deaths they caused?
I don't think that's a morally righteous thing to do. First of all, because I think, from what I've read, most of these scientists are criminals, first of all. So you're basically saying, hey, let's get a bunch of criminals to help us with science, which, in my opinion, is morally the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, I do not believe it was morally justified to get people who could be considered, and I would consider them war criminals, to then work in the country which they fought against and committed crimes against, to then help them benefit, and granting them asylum and condemning them, well, not condemning, but like letting them get away with all the things that they had done by giving the technology to someone else. I don't think that was morally justified, but it did advance science into a new realm, into like rocketry, rocket science, and into space exploration. But those people who they helped, I do not think they should have been helped.
Yeah.
And if, for example, they didn't help, somebody else would. So you didn't really necessarily need them. And also it's quite an injustice for the victims, the people.
Yeah, I would disagree with you on that because, yes, someone would eventually come along. It's not like art, it's someone would eventually figure it out, But I do believe that, Germans were the expert in this field, and, in 20 years, maybe there would have been a counterpart in the US, but, that did give them quite a jump start. And you have to consider the Cold War situation, the US trying to get ahead of the Soviets and the Soviets trying to get ahead of the US. And they were fighting over these scientists because, each one of them was pretty much a boost to everything they had.
Yeah.
And, coming back to, all the high-tech stuff we talked about, radar, radios, jet aircraft, do you think these technological innovations, no matter how, advanced they were, no matter how there was no counterpart in the Allies' forces, do you think the production of these and the shifting towards these weapons did cost Germany the war? Because if you look at the Allies and Soviets, for example, they really put into mass production. For Sherman, the T-34, examples of mass-produced vehicles, as well as, for example, the UK, where they would produce literally wooden aircraft, the de Havilland Mosquito, for example, famously a nearly completely wooden construction. Do you think if the Germans didn't focus so much on these technologies, do you think they would have had a higher chance figuring out how to mass-produce what they already had?
Well, so you're saying that, just to clarify what you're asking, is that you're asking that if they wouldn't have focused on the Wunderwaffe, they would have had a higher chance of mass producing or winning the war?
If they didn't focus so much on it and focus their effort on mass production of already existing
would they be able to win the war?
Well, not win the war, but, would the war have changed significantly?
I don't think so. The war was not going to end in Germany's favor.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, no, because they are, one major country in Europe, because Italy was a major power, but
it wasn't really up to
incompetent
basis.
leadership and not real proper effective weaponry, especially compared to their enemies. Even though technological superiority does help, I do not think that even if they would have mass produced their weapons, Germany would not have been able to make much of an impact. They would have lasted a bit longer, I believe, because they would have had more money, and therefore they wouldn't have equipment shortages, which they had near the end of the war. But I do think that it wouldn't have changed much.
Yeah, I believe that after Barbarossa, pretty much the war was lost.
Yeah.
They attacked too late. They should have attacked way earlier because the Soviets were able to build up a higher force than at the beginning in 39. And, moving, since we're already talking about the Soviets moving even more east, we talked about Europe to death right now, but we are forgetting a key theater in World War II. We're forgetting the Pacific theater. Yeah. So, do you think it was harder than Europe? Do you think it was bloodier?
The Pacific?
Well, there's no such thing as a harder front because everything...
causing more casualties.
I don't know casualty numbers. I do know that it was a completely different type of warfare because Europe was mainly land and air-based. This was mainly naval and air-based. Yeah. So it completely shifted the bases and for example, I heard a story where a American soldier who fought in Pacific, an American soldier who fought in Europe, they talked about their experiences together. And they couldn't really relate on many things. They could relate on some things, because they were both in war, but they were they were facing completely different enemies, completely different reasons for fighting, because the ones in Pacific were defending their homeland, while the United States, because Japan didn't pose a threat, but it sort of seemed to. Mm-hmm. And the ones in Europe, they were fighting more for an ideological good than for a protective measure. Yeah. But both at the fronts, they were different. There's no such thing as a harder front of war.
I would say the Pacific was if we take the word harder at its face value, I do think the Pacific was harder. Because you got to look at weather, you got to look at climate, you got to look at supply shortages. In Europe, it got a bit cold. Well, you can put on, it's a bad example, but you can put on an extra jacket. It's stand next to a fire. Yeah. But the Pacific, monsoon season, it would rain for months. And people would literally take their lives because they went mad because of the water.
And plus the seas, right?
Yeah, the seas as well. It is a kind of forgotten fact, but Japanese had quite a potent submarine force, and so did the US. I would have said a fun fact. That is not a fun fact. The biggest maritime loss of life in US history was actually during the Pacific Theater. And it wasn't because the Japanese sunk a ship. It wasn't because whatever. It was a US submarine which torpedoed a Japanese prisoner ship, which was carrying over 2,000 American soldiers. And fun fact, that submarine later went missing and is still not found to this day. Near the Aleutian Islands, nobody knows what happened to it. But yet, over 2,000 people, 9 people out of that entire ship survived. 5 of them taking a lifeboat and sailing over, I think, 600 nautical miles to the Chinese coast and surviving. The other 4 were recaptured by the Japanese and treated as POWs to the rest of the world. But, I do think that, for the average Joe, I do think the Pacific was way harder to fight on.
Yeah.
And, regarding also the Pacific, we can't forget the thing that started all with both Pearl Harbor and the invasion of the Philippines. And there is quite a myth now of a certain man, which was the commanding officer of the U.S. forces in the Philippines at that time, and then later served as the commanding of forces in Korea, a General MacArthur. And a lot of people have this idea now that he was this superhuman. He was this great leader. His ideas were always the best. Yeah. And, he was the one sticking it up to the brass. Fighting for the common soldier. And do you think that's true? Considering in the Philippines, it was his decisions that pretty much led to the fall of the Philippines. And before the Philippines fell, the man got extracted by U.S. forces in the middle of the night and left all of his soldiers behind. And he was pulled back to the States. He survived the Philippines pretty much unharmed. And do you think that with people believing MacArthur who he was, do you think that's valid? Do you think there are points to on his behalf?
Well, I do believe he was a good general. First, yes, he had a lot of flaws. There is no such thing as a superhuman or a superhuman tactician. He was a good tactician, not the best in the war, I wouldn't say. He also had ideological extremes, like after the war he wanted to nuke China.
Yeah, the sea of radioactive cobalt.
Yeah, so I don't think he should be given this superhuman persona, but he should be well respected for his victories in the war, as most generals should be.
No. And, you already brought up nuking China, so let's nuke a different country.
Yeah.
Do you think the nuking or the nuclear attack on both Nagasaki and Japan was the best option? I know it's a far-flung topic, but it is in the discussion space. Even 8 years after the end of World War II, do you think it was the best choice that they had?
No, I wouldn't say it was the best choice because, from what I've heard, Japan was ready to surrender at that point. So nuking them was like a bit of waste of time, and it killed a lot of innocent people, which is never justified, really. If the U.S. just invaded, it could have avoided. As I said previously, Japan was ready to surrender, so there was really no point in all that.
The thing with invading Japan, and at least the mainland Japan, the islands, there was a different story, is that the U.S. knew one thing, and they did prepare for it. For example, they minted enough Purple Hearts that they were still issued in the Gulf War. They knew that if they stepped foot on the Japanese mainland, you'd have millions of casualties. Millions, everybody would take up arms, and you would pretty much be fighting over blood. And, in my opinion, even though how horrific the attacks were, it was a civilian population center, and, it was quite horrific. But, out of all the options they had, I think it was the best. And even the decision to both nuke Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it wasn't just because we think we just throw a dartboard or a dart onto the map and those cities were the choice. No, the U.S. did sit down. U.S. president as well as the chiefs of staff did sit down, and they literally went city by city. They wanted to nuke Kobe. Kobe wasn't an option. It was a historic and cultural center. If they did, the Japanese would not give up. And even the fact that they nuked 2 cities instead of 1, because I would agree that nuking 1, we should have stopped at that, The thing was that if they nuked 1, the Japanese may think, okay, they nuked us, and they have no other weapons. That took them X amount of years to develop this, to produce this. It's a one-trick pony. But nuking 2 cities showed the Japanese, showed Hirohito, that the U.S. could do this on and on and on. And again, and that was actually one of the things the U.S. said to Japan. If you don't surrender, we're going to continue. But also, I don't believe that was the key. It was a big part, but I don't think it was the sole reason for the Japanese surrender. We got to, of course, think of the situation in Manchuria, with both the Chinese pushing actively against the Japanese, and also the Soviets, after the defeat of Germany, did start shifting forces to the Pacific. And I do believe that Hirohito and all of his generals knew that if the war would go on, Japan would end up like Germany. It would end up split between East and West, and that nearly happened. So they made a strategic decision to just give up to the US solely.
Yeah.
I do believe that comparing what happened to Germany after the war and to Japan, I do believe they made the right call.
Yeah, it's also important to note that before they did nuke the 2 cities, they were bombing Japan.
Yeah, firebombings of Japan.
Firebombing. So I think that if they would have invaded Japan, not only would there be more casualties from both sides, especially from armies, because it'd be a slow, grueling fight, but the United States would continue firebombing it, which would cause more civilian casualties in the long run. So while nuclear a civilian population is not, I don't think was the best idea, even though after what you said, especially because it caused lots of civilian casualties, I do think that in the long run it would have provided less casualties than if they would have invaded, kept on firebombing, and fought all the way to Tokyo.
Yeah, plus remember that, they chose these cities because they were not, it's mean to say this, it's very sad to say this, but, they were not culturally relevant. They were not important cities. Because if what you said, they would have continued firebombing, what would happen? Everything would be firebombed.
Yeah.
All the culture, everything would be wiped out. It would just be a scorched earth from Kobe all the way to the Sakashima Islands. You know, we're actually going to come back to strategic bombing and firebombing. It's literally, I think, the next point. No, it's not the next point. The next point is we're going to go back west to the USSR and to the Eastern Front itself. You know, well, I think it's a very important front in World War II. You know, I do have the belief that, you know, the failure of the Third Reich to seize the USSR did cause their failure to protect themselves from the naval landings at Normandy. So do you agree with that? Do you think that, you know, it did provide the Allies the opportunity to land in the West?
Yeah, definitely. Once the Soviets started pushing back, the Nazis were fighting a two-front war. So you had the Allies, well, France, Britain, and America coming from the West, and from the East you had the Soviets. Yeah. So that definitely did put pressure on them as they had to allocate resources equally.
Yeah, I do feel that, yes, well, Operation Barbarossa was a significant failure. Even if they wouldn't have done it, they would not have won the war.
Yeah.
Because at that point, they had no possibility of leaving the European continent. They had no way, unless they allied with some other major European naval power, they could not reach Britain. Yeah. Because the British Navy, combined with the French Reserve Navy that was in Africa, there was no way that they could have possibly invaded Britain, let alone the United States. Mm-hmm. And at some point, the United States was going to join the war because Japan was getting restless. And they wanted to invade, and Germany sort of felt obligated to. So Operation Barbarossa was vital, obviously. Yeah. And I do feel it was a significant turning point in the war. Because I'm not sure if I heard the story correctly, but when a leader, I'm pretty sure Churchill, heard the news about Germany declaring war on the Soviet Union, he sort of had two reactions. He had one reaction was like, I told you so, because he was warning Stalin. But he also had another reaction, which is like, we can win now. We're going to go back to Europe at some point, because now they had opened a major front with their biggest ideological rival. And so enemy of an enemy becomes a friend. They could work together with Lend-Lease and all that. So it was a major turning point. If Germany wouldn't have done Operation Barbarossa, the war would have ended in the Allied favor, but way longer.
Yeah. And, you know, you mentioned Lend-Lease. Do you think the Soviet victory, you know, in some part, in a major part, was, you know, assisted by Lend-Lease? Or do you think, like, even with a very limited or even no Lend-Lease itself, do you think the Soviets would have won? Or at least, you know, even with the front moving slower, they would have eventually reached Berlin?
They could. I don't think they could have eventually reached Berlin, because there was a major stopping power behind the biggest three major objectives. So I feel in the early stages of the actual invasion itself in 1941 and 42, I do feel Lend-Lease was a major factor, because it boosted their weaponry and their arsenal, so they could actually hold back even after some reorganization, which led, because at that point Germany had not been able to capture their three strategic objectives, which were the entirety of the Ukraine and southern Russia, Moscow and Leningrad. And those were the three major objectives. And I do think that Lend-Lease was an important factor in that. And I do think that without Lend-Lease, the Soviets would not have capitulated either way. But I do think they would have slowed down and maybe not even have reached Berlin in time. They might have pushed back to the original border after a lot more casualties, because they'd have to scramble to move their factories east as they did, but they already had weapons made from the United States.
Yeah, and do you think, you know, with the casualties, do you think, you know, the USSR's doctrine, do you think, you know, all the casualties were justified in reaching the strategic objectives, you know, of winning the war?
Casualties are never justified.
Yeah.
Death is not something that you can just justify because of something that some man wants to do. And especially in war, there should not be a tolerance for death of anyone. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, if that view, I say the casualties weren't justified. But at that point, the command had no real other option. I do believe that if they had done any other strategy, it could have worked out. and it did work out, and it led to a lot of unnecessary casualties. But yeah, I don't think the casualties were justified.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree with you, even though, a lot of the casualties that the Soviet Union took was in the beginning during Operation Barbarossa. Well, they were pretty much scrambling to set up as many defensive lines between the Germans and Moscow. It was quite a bloody set of years. They didn't really have a lot of equipment. They weren't. Yeah. They were prepared for a conflict with Germany. Let's be honest, they were preparing for that. But they were preparing for them to assault Germany and not the other way around. So, for example, we look at the BT series of light tanks with the Christie suspension. They were not designed to, first of all, fight the tanks that the Germans faced against them, the Germans put against them, but also they were fast. They didn't have any armor, and they were just supposed to drive as far as possible, drive as fast as possible. So, when you put them in a position where, hey, just hold this point, hold this village for as long as you physically can, and then either fall back or die there. You really look at older equipment, like you can tell that they were not prepared for a defensive battle. And that's why I think most casualties are pretty much proclaimed to that, as well as their doctrine in the early Operation Barbarossa, where they weren't really prepared to fight a defensive war.
Yeah.
And do you also think that World War II was the last big war we'll see in Europe? With recent events, I think that's quite a relevant topic.
Yeah.
But do you think with nuclear deterrence, with the Cold War, NATO, and now the slowly rebuilding, Eastern forces, do you think there is still a threat of a war in Europe or a larger war in Europe, or do you think that is long past us? And the worst we can see is small skirmishes or proxy wars.
I think the worst we can see is maybe conflict between two nations, but a large-scale war like World War II is highly unlikely, primarily because there's more deterrence and that's a reason why. For example, I'm just going to take a random country. For example, Russia, right? I don't think it has... If it has the motivation, there's not much benefit of going in a full-scale war with Europe due to NATO, and I think both sides are kind of reliant on each other, trade policies and all. So the likeliness is very little.
Yeah, I think due to mutually assured destruction of that, if one major power goes to war with another major power, nukes will be dropped, world ends. Because of the idea of mutually assured destruction, I don't think major wars will break out. They are more likely now than they were before, but I doubt that they'd happen. I doubt it'd be more proxy wars like what happened in the Cold War.
Yeah.
And it's just another Cold War. There won't be another World War like the first two. Or like the French-Indian War, which was a major war which encompassed the whole world. Because at that point, countries didn't possess the power to end the world or wipe out entire cities, wipe out entire towns, entire populations, and if this is done enough, end what can be seen as the human race, because at that point, weaponry wasn't as advanced. And as weaponry advances, warfare changes. And I think now warfare is more of a state of intimidation than actual proper conflict.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. And, World War II was 80 years ago, but do you still feel that we still are influenced militarily from that conflict, with both strategies and different doctrines? Do you think there are still some remnants of that, or do you think we already moved past that and we're in a completely new era?
I think you should go.
Okay. I think that there are still some remnants of that. Remnants of tactics, ideologies, everything. There's remnants of that. There's remnants of all of history and everything. I do think there have been other conflicts, in the Middle East and in Vietnam and also in Africa, some small-scale wars everywhere. I do think that military tactics have developed a lot past the ideas that were developed in the Second World War, but I also think they're based off of those ideas, like tank warfare and modern combined arms warfare, those were developed, and that sort of semblance of combined arms warfare, which are used in modern day military strategies, are sort of resemblances of World War II. So they are there, but not as prevalent.
Yeah, I like to bring up a opinion of a Vietnam War vet. His name was Charles O'Brien. He passed away in 2020 due to COVID. But, he did say, that history is a flat wheel. And, we will see all of this recurring. And I think he was right. Because when you, for example, look at Ukraine right now, we have come back full circle to World War I trench tactics. Yeah. And I do think, how much unlikely it was before that you would say, oh, we will never go back to we're beyond that. We're just going to be having mobile warfare. I do believe that at some point, at least some memories of World War II, some things that we saw during World War II, I think will come back in some form, in some conflict, And do you, regarding, we've already mentioned to death Europe, we already mentioned to death the Pacific. So now we're probably going to be left with the last major theater of World War II. That is Africa, North Africa to be exact. And do you think it was, in the eyes of both the Allies and the Germans, how do you think it was strategic? Because, for example, we look at the Allies, we have got the Suez Canal, which is the obvious. But what do you think the Germans saw in Africa? What do you think was their motivation to send Rommel and his panzer divisions all the way to Africa to fight in poor terrain and to completely at one point stop supporting them logistically, which did at least somewhat participate, at least in some point, it did influence the collapse of Rommel's army. What do you think they saw in Africa?
Okay. I believe, this is from my perspective, if I would place myself as a regular, for example, Italian man who lived in Italy during this time, the Axis powers were a European alliance. With obviously, they had some alliances with Japan, but they were a European alliance themselves. And so if they would just limit themselves to Europe, I feel, especially because Italy already had colonies in Africa, which is what they were defending, essentially, and the Mediterranean was right there. They were right next, so they couldn't really protect their own holdings in Europe if there was a way to get there. So I do think that, especially capturing the Suez, was a important reason why they did go for Africa, to stop this close proximity from especially the remnants of France to France, because the remnants of France and the generals that didn't support the new German state, the new German puppet state that is, were in Africa, and they had captured North Africa. They were back. They were pushing up north. So I do think it was important for the Axis to secure Africa, or at least a certain point, so that there wouldn't be the threat of a southern naval invasion and a northern naval invasion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I do think that, especially with Italy, it was a priority to seize the entirety of the northern coast of Africa to prevent, even if we look, that is exactly what happened. Yeah. The landings in Italy were they only happened because the African theater was won by the Allies. And do you think the myth of Rommel, we know it's a thing, but how accurate do you think it is? Do you think it's the same with MacArthur. Do you think he lives up to the name?
That's a tough question, because you look at his scorecard, what he won and when he lost. He won a lot of tank battles. He was a big innovator when it comes to tank combat. But yet again, he was good at this one thing, at tanks, which was a big thing at this point, because tank combat had only really developed at this point. And considering the fact that there's one person, or only a small group of people who are really good at this, and a couple who, the majority who aren't, he could be seen, I agree, how when people say he was this great general, but also, at the same time, he was a good tank general. But combining it with combined arms warfare or infantry, you wouldn't really hold him up as a great general, but a great tank commander, which is, I think, what he should be referred to. People could refer to him as one of Germany's greatest generals. he was, specifically as tanks.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there. And since we're already in Africa, and you mentioned the Italian colonies, do you think with how many, for example, Commonwealth countries participated, we've got India, we had Canada, we had South Africa, both North and South Rhodesia, we had all these different colonies participating in the war. Do you think their role is getting slightly forgotten with the amount of stuff they did for the war effort? Do you think, Western countries are, pushing back, their involvement and, trying to forget the fact that, they took place?
Absolutely. I mean, we learned in year 12 history, I would just like to drop in a little bit of year 12 history here. Thank you, Mr. Wright. We learned at the start of the Unit 2, which is South Africa, we learned about this thing called, these South African sort of pro-Germans who fought against South Africans, the government. So and because the major reason why South Africa fell to apartheid was because the major government had supported the British. So I think that the role of these countries are mainly forgotten because it impacted everyone, even countries that didn't fight mainly in the war, that aren't remembered for fighting in the war, like Brazil isn't remembered for fighting, but it affected them a lot because they sent men as well, and their men also fought and died and had stories, and it affected them back home. So yes, absolutely. The major ideals of it's just the British, the French, the Americans pushing it and forgetting about the colonies and the smaller countries that helped, especially like the role of African countries who, especially the colonies, and even in Ethiopian resistance movements, and Liberia, who did send troops as well as volunteers to the United States. So I do think that these countries they were forgotten, and they don't deserve to be forgotten because no one in war deserves to be forgotten.
Yeah, and do you think, with how they've been forgotten, do you think World War II was a turning point for all of these countries' movement towards independence?
For a lot of the cases, yeah. I'm gonna yet again talk about South Africa because that's the thing I know the most about. Supporting the British in the Second World War was a major reason why South Africa left the Commonwealth. I don't know much about the East Asian colonies. I know primarily about the battles that happened in Burma and in India.
Yeah, Burma is a very forgotten front, by the way. Not a lot of mentions in it.
I don't know much about it, obviously, because it's very forgotten. But I do know that in some ways, this sort of idea of being dragged into a fight that you didn't want to fight sort of led to a lot of independence movements starting.
We also got to look at the fact that a lot of people who served in World War II from these countries later moved into politics, and they were the ones pushing for independence.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring up Rhodesia again. For example, the Prime Minister, Ian Smith, he was the one to declare independence of Rhodesia from a very complicated story, but North and South Rhodesia made a federation. It was a complete failure. And then Southern Rhodesia declared their independence as the Republic of Rhodesia. And Ian Smith was the one to proclaim the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And he was actually a World War II veteran. He flew Spitfires for the Royal Air Force over Italy. He got shot down, moved through Italian resistance. He escaped to France, met up with American forces, then and spent the rest of the war in England. So, I think that a lot of experiences from World War II really shaped these men to later go into politics. Yeah. Some of them experienced serious discriminations from, for example, in France, you got to look at the Fusiliers from Africa. They were heavily discriminated upon. They were even removed from history in some instances, after the war, and they didn't get any pensions for the ones that fought in the war for the longest time. So I do believe that, these two topics are heavily linked, They're trying to forget them because they broke away, and said countries have broken away because they were forgotten. And, we're slowly running out of time, and we still have some topics to go through. So, let's go rapid fire, With how the World War II ended, do you think the division of Europe into East and West, do you think that was the best choice? And do you think some places got left out of the discussions at Yalta? For example, we can look at Poland. Poland made great contributions to the Allied war effort. Polish paratroopers were at Arnhem. They were fighting in the War of the Atlantic, many Polish vessels. And do you think, some countries got forgotten and just handed to the Soviets, hey, take this, don't take our stuff? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna let you talk in a bit. Sorry, I'm
Yeah, sure.
really passionate about this thing.
Yeah,
Czechoslovakia, the 1944 Slovak uprising, where Czech and Slovak people rose up against the German puppet regime. They got completely demolished because they were under-equipped. But then afterwards, they were given independence. They voted for a democratic government, and then the democratic government got overthrown by a pro-Soviet government.
Yeah.
So countries were just handed to the Soviets, and it could have been a more democratic system. But yet again, Soviet influence was growing in Eastern Europe, especially because their troops were there. So it was probably going to happen, but it was not the best way of doing things.
And do you think, after the war, the Marshall Plan, as well as the Soviet economic stimulus packages to the new states, do you think they were more of a projection of power, or do you think they were like genuine, lifelines for these countries?
Projection of power, definitely. Yeah. That the communist parties of France were gaining popularity during the time, so the Marshall Plan was generally to stomp them out and prevent communism spreading.
Yeah, I agree with the idea of projection of power, but I do think it did help.
Yeah,
a lot of places. It was a lifeline for many places, but it was done as a projection of power, but it did serve as a lifeline. So it was both.
Yeah.
No, I definitely agree.
I definitely agree.
So any closing remarks, guys? Because we're slowly running out of time. Yeah.
So thank you for having me. I'm glad I was able to talk about this and talk about what we learned in Year 12 history and my hyperfixation about Czechoslovakia during the Second World War.
Ishan?
I'm just happy to be here.
Aren't we all? So, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you didn't get too fussed about the topics we discussed today. Guys, that's it, guys.